On this, the first Sunday of Lent, we're accustomed to hearing the gospel story about the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. Mark's telling is characteristically brief, just 2 verses, tucked between Jesus' baptism and the start of his public ministry in Galilee. That's it. No elaborate back and forth between Jesus and the devil, where the devil tries to get Jesus to prove himself by turning stones to bread or jumping from the pinnacle of the temple, as Matthew and Luke tell the story. Just this. The Spirit drove him into the wilderness. He was there for 40 days, tested by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. The rest is left to our imagination. So let's work through that bit by bit. First, the Spirit drove him into the wilderness. It was immediately after Jesus' baptism when that very same Spirit descended upon him like a dove, and a voice from the heavens said, "You are my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." It seems a very abrupt change of tone from the assurance of his belovedness to this time of testing and trial. Jesus did not enter the wilderness by choice. Next, he spends 40 days in the wilderness. 40 is an important number here. The people of Israel wandered in the wilderness for 40 years before reaching the Promised Land. On 2 separate occasions, Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai receiving the commandments, and Elijah traveled 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb. So 40 signified a time of testing or transformation. It showed that something important was about to happen, something that required preparation and attention. Jesus was tested by Satan. Mark doesn't say anything about the outcome of the testing, but it would seem that he understands Jesus to have emerged as victorious over Satan. For as we read on in Mark's gospel, we learn that Jesus performs many exorcisms, and curiously, we're told on more than one occasion that the demons acknowledge his power over them. They recognize him and announce him as the Son of God. But we don't know exactly how they've come to know that. He was with wild beasts. I wonder what that looked like. Was Jesus living in some sort of peaceable kingdom in which wild animals were domesticated, like in chapter 11 of Isaiah? The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. Or perhaps these animals remained in their wildness, but somehow Jesus was protected from harm, perhaps by the angels who waited on him. This is the image found in Psalm 91. For he will command his angels to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up so that you will not dash your foot against a stone. You will tread on the lion and the adder, the young lion and the serpent you will trample underfoot. Wild beasts and angels. There's something about Mark's description of Jesus in the wilderness that activates the imagination. The wilderness is a liminal space at the edge of civilization, opening out into the untamed places. It calls to mind the iconic children's story by Maurice Sendak called Where the Wild Things Are. It's the story of a lively little boy named Max who puts on a wolf costume and scampers around his house, wreaking havoc until his mother sent him to his room without supper. There, he retreats into his imagination. He sails off on a very long voyage to where the wild things are. The wild things look like scary monsters, but, spoiler alert, a fearless Max tames them, and they make him their king. And they all have a grand time being wild together until Max grows weary and hungry and lonely. So he makes his imaginary return voyage to find supper waiting for him in his room. Published in 1963, this little book created quite a stir because of its haunting illustrations, a shadowy other world filled with wild things, with sharp teeth and claws. It was also critiqued for Max's tantrumy behavior and also his mother's, who punished him, sending him off without supper. But the book was also heralded for its groundbreaking journey away from the pastel colors and facile themes of the Dick and Jane books into some more nuanced, shadowy, and temperamental corners of human nature, particularly as seen through the eyes of a child. The words and images of Sendak's story would reorder the world of children's literature, expanding the possibilities for what could be talked about. It dared to acknowledge a family that wasn't perfect, with overactive children and tired parents. It showed ways to cope with big emotions, to take time outs, to allow the curious mind to wander, and to return and rest in the steady love of his mother. It was an honest look at what it means to grow up as a human child in this world, curious, imperfect, learning, loved. The story culminates in Max's encounter with the wild things. Listen. When he came to the place where the wild things are, they roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws till Max said, "Be still." Then we're told that Max tamed the wild things by staring into their eyes without blinking. He looked them in the eye and refused to turn away. This, I imagine, is how Jesus prevailed over Satan and the wild beasts, by looking them in the eye and refusing to turn away. Honestly, compassionately, fearlessly. This is, after all, how Jesus would spend his entire ministry, advocating for those whom society had rejected, befriending sinners and tax collectors, casting out demons from suffering souls, even shouting into a raging storm, commanding the wind and the waves, "Be still." The story of Jesus' testing in the wilderness shows us the depth of his humanity, which included all of the hard things, hunger and thirst, and loneliness and fear and anguish. Jesus knew all of the wild things. And the story also expands our imagination to show the extent of Jesus' compassion, which he received from the angels who waited on him. From these, he learned to direct his compassionate gaze to the one in need right in front of him. He touched the untouchables and loved the unlovely. Isn't it true that our capacity for compassion is forged in our own experiences of suffering, struggle, and loss? And isn't it also true that our capacity for healing is often tied to our ability to look right at a thing directly. This is a core insight for many recovery groups, which provide kinship for others journeying towards sobriety. It is in honestly acknowledging our own limitations and in holding space for others to have an honest look at theirs that we can work together toward healing and wholeness. Lent is a wilderness time, a time to acknowledge our limitations, to have an honest look at the things we find hard, all that is unwieldy, unlovely, or even frightening, and to encounter there the still and steadfast gaze of Jesus and the care of his holy angels who await us with mercy and healing. As a community of people learning to follow Jesus, may we encourage one another to grow in awareness and wisdom as we journey together as human persons through this world of wild beasts and angels, curious, imperfect, learning, loved.